This panel here is going to be called the FedRAMP Multiplier Effect. Again, I'm Chris Hughes, president and co-founder of Aquia. This one we're going to be joined by Howard, Brianna, and Sunny. Thanks for joining us. You guys want to give a brief introduction real quick here for folks that don't know you?
Sure. My name is Howard Levinson. I've spent 40 years selling technology and solutions to the federal government. Most recently, I was the founder and general manager of Databricks' federal business, and I retired about a year ago, so I have no dog in the fight.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brianna Tucci, and I am with Amazon Web Services Marketplace team. My role at AWS is as the Intelligence Community Marketplace program lead. So in that role, I wear two hats. I help industry join the IC Marketplace. I work with companies to onboard into our program, and then once they are part of our program, help them to sell to the intelligence community. And then I also wear the hat of National Security Customer Advisor. And in that role, I support our government customers finding the right products that they need off of our marketplace. And once they do find the right products, I help them to actually procure and deploy those products on the high side in the AWS secret and top secret regions. Prior to joining AWS, I was at In-Q-Tel supporting a lot of the same customers and industry partners. Thrilled to be here. Thank you.
And good afternoon. I'm Sunny Hashmi. I'm currently, as of 2 months ago, run the global public sector practice at Uncork. But as of before 2 months ago, I was part of the administration running the Federal Acquisition Service over at GSA as a commissioner. Part of the Federal Acquisition Service, some of you know, also includes the Technology Transformation Service, where the FedRAMP program is housed. So I had the privilege of overseeing that program for a number of years. I was also part of the founding team that came up with FedRAMP back in 2009, 2010. Back when I was the CIO for GSA, I was also on the FedRAMP Joint Authorization Board for a number of years. And I've also spent a number of years in the private sector over the last couple of decades, including since 2009 and the inception of FedRAMP, where I've taken 2 different companies through the process from the private sector. And so I've got visibility into the government GRC challenge from both inside and outside.
Yeah, I'll caveat that with you'll hear some maybe contradictory perspectives between these two, but it'll keep it interesting today. So Sunny, I did want to start with you, given your background at FedRAMP and TTS, and on the commercial side as well. When you engage, when you start to talk to companies and talk about engaging the pursuit of FedRAMP, is there a certain size or revenue or compliance readiness you kind of start with for firms to be ready for pursuing FedRAMP?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a tough question because, and we're going to get into this in the conversation. Like, I mean, it's certainly well known and understandable that there's lots to be done to improve the program, and it's become unnecessarily burdensome. And there's aspects of the program that certainly can be improved for sure. But when I talk about companies who are quote unquote ready to go through FedRAMP, the thing to remember is the baseline has been public from the very beginning, right? There's no surprise and there's no secret sauce on what is required to go through FedRAMP. It's complicated. It's a big baseline. You can argue whether it's right or wrong, but everybody knows what that is. What I usually tell companies is that get awareness going very, very early. Because what happens is that at the very early stage, Series A stage in your company, as you're thinking about your architecture, you're thinking about your product, your go-to-market strategy, your marketing strategy, your commercials, your pricing, you're making decisions at that time that later on, when you actually go through FedRAMP, are either going to support you or hinder you. So how you define your architecture, how your application stack is designed, are you single tenant, multi-tenant? Do you allow for direct connects? Which cloud provider do you work with? All those decisions that you're making when you're a Series A company with 20 people in a basement, those decisions become either anchors or rocket ships for you 3-4 years later when you're going through either FedRAMP or DoD SRG level 3, 4, 5 or whatever. So oftentimes I see companies, when they get to that stage, they have to re-engineer and re-architect a bunch of their stack, which is where time, effort, and money goes. So they realize that, oh my God, we can't do FedRAMP because the encryption module that we selected 3 years ago is not approved by 140-2. And now we have to re-engineer all of our encryption stuff. So make those choices ahead of time. So then when you get to FedRAMP, you can actually be fast. I've seen companies go through FedRAMP in as little as 6 months. True story. And I've seen companies go through FedRAMP in as much as 3 to 4 years because of the amount of rework that they have to do in their stack, right? So make those decisions early, even if you're not ready yet to go through the FedRAMP process. Typically, what I say is that you need to have, ideally, experience working with a non-governmental regulated industry client or a set of clients before you start really investing in FedRAMP, because it is a process, it is an investment, and that ROI is a year to 2 out. So you need to have revenue stream somewhere else that sustains your company until that ROI becomes positive in the public sector.
Makes sense. It's a lot of great considerations for a company. And I wanted to bring something up to Howard, and honestly, all of you, because I know you had some opinions on it, and I know you likely do, given your background in the intelligence community and Department of Defense and so on, and I'll start with Howard. I know you have some thoughts on certain routes versus, perhaps like the FedRAMP pathway, but also self-hosted in some cases to avoid the cost or burden of FedRAMP or go that route, right? And there's some pros and cons of that approach. What are some of your opinions on that, in terms of how you advise companies?
Yeah, so I do a lot of advisory work today, and while I agree with everything that the FedRAMP effort tries to accomplish, the problem is if you're trying to satisfy the whole federal government, you've got FedRAMP, you've got FedRAMP High, some of those are in GovCloud, which are different regions. You've got Impact Level 4 or Impact Level 5. The intelligence community wants ICD 503. So getting FedRAMP gets you access to potentially a third of the government, a third of the spend. And as soon as you get, with all due respect, as soon as you get your Amazon FedRAMP, well, the next customer says, no, we want ours in Azure. And so the combination and permutations for reaching compliance with the federal government is overwhelming for any startup company. So my advice to startup companies has been, and this is what we implemented at Databricks, and we just kind of fell into this. It wasn't that well thought out a strategy, but when we started at Databricks, our first client, believe it or not, was the CIA. They had just stood up C2S, and they said, we need some managed services here, and we got lucky, and Databricks was chosen as one of those managed services. But the agency was not very comfortable with SaaS workloads at the time. And they said, we like this whole idea of SaaS, but we don't like the fact that you guys can look in and see who our users are and what we're doing. So we actually built a platform for them that I say looked like a SaaS, smelled like a SaaS, operated like a SaaS. It installed via CloudFormation scripts. It was trivial to install and fairly easy to update, but it ran completely within the customer's virtual private cloud. And by that definition, it's not a SaaS. And therefore, the FedRAMP and all of those other cloud compliance regulations didn't apply. And we built this for the CIA, and I'm up talking to Dave and his peers over at Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services. I mentioned that we have this capability. They go, well, that'll serve our needs because all we need is a FISMA requirement. And if you guys are willing to work with us on the FISMA credentials, we could probably get that done very quickly. So we documented all of the security controls for FISMA. I think Dave was one of the guys that read through them all and validated them all. And that became our approach. And what happened from there was Capital One said, that thing you got over at the CIA, we like that too. And by the way, Apple Computer said the same thing. And so suddenly this implementation of Databricks that we called PVC, Private Virtual Cloud, became a thing for our federal clients as well as for some of our commercial clients. Now, over time, we've had the opportunity to look more closely at the FedRAMP regulations, and the product has grown pretty dramatically. And we already knew that the market opportunity existed in federal because we had sold this PVC implementation to so many different federal customers that we ultimately came back and built the FedRAMP and built the FedRAMP High and built an IL5 version of Databricks. So now you can run it in either of those fashions. And the goal is ultimately to move to the true SaaS version that offers all of that functionality and all of the benefits of a SaaS. So that's our story. And for startup companies, when you think about all those permutations and combinations that I mentioned at the beginning, if you can just build a non-SaaS version at the beginning and test and validate the market, you might be in a better position later on to convince your company to make the investment to do the full SaaS compliance.
And I know Sunny has some counterpoints or considerations of challenges of going that route. But Brianna, real quick for you in the defense and intelligence community and so on, how do you see AWS partners and SaaS companies approach this kind of paradigm of self-hosted or virtual private offering versus like a true SaaS offering?
Well, I think Howard hit the nail on the head. I'm seeing more and more industry partners choosing to develop an alternative solution to their commercial SaaS solution to get their foot in the door with federal customers and particularly the intelligence community. Now, it could be the way that Howard described with Databricks, or it could be a different way. It could be establishing a container-based image or an Amazon machine image that's able to be deployed through the intelligence community marketplace of AWS into the intelligence community's high-side cloud environments, rather than trying to get your foot in the door and start building a SaaS solution on the high side from day one. I just want to echo.
If I could just add, we did deliver it via AMIs, and it was the same code base as our SaaS version. There was just, some code that created the PVC version. So it was not a huge burden on the engineering team to do that.
Absolutely, and what I've heard from government customers is that sometimes when the industry partner is able to re-architect or engineer a solution that's specific to them in, an AMI or a CFT, a container, so on and so forth, sometimes it's actually more relevant to them than the commercial SaaS-based alternative.
How about you, Sunny? I know you had some considerations of that's a great approach.
So first of all, I don't have fundamentally any disagreement with that. What I do want to, I maybe have a little bit of a counterpoint. I think people think that all of this is fine if the primary focus is how do we get across the GRC landscape, right? How do we get to the ATO? And that makes perfect sense. What is the fastest path there? And if there's other paths to do it, we'll do it. The risk that comes with that, though, and this is a problem that most people don't understand, that the residual risk is a certified amount, like a certain amount of risk. Whether it's and it's not just cybersecurity risk, it's operational risk, operational cost and burden. Somebody has to bear that risk. The cloud is not just a technology delivery model; it's also a business model that goes along with it. So if you're going to if your primary delivery mechanism becomes a VPC model, then you have to understand both as a company that our business model is different now. Because what they're essentially doing is that the government then has to assume the operational burden and risk. And most government agencies don't realize that. And the reason why I say that is because there's a litany of IG reports going back to 1995 that tells you the government doesn't patch shit. They don't do version updates. They don't do FROMs. They don't do backups. They don't do sharding of databases. They don't scale. And guess what? When that system goes down, guess whose fault it is? It's yours. Databricks is never up. That circle goes round and round and never shows up. I know government customers today who are running SharePoint 2006 because feature parity stopped when Microsoft moved to an online version of SharePoint. Right? So that's just a small thing that shouldn't be that hard to migrate into a SaaS environment. But now you as a company have a different business model problem, because now you have to sustain multiple versions of your product, because one customer is going to say, I don't want to go to your next version. It breaks the thing that I built on your thing. So now you're managing 3, 4, 5, 6 versions of your. So today it sounds great, but 10 years from now, you may find yourself as a company forcing your customers to update, and and having conversations around which versions of your software are out of support. No company wants to have that conversation. That's not a problem today, but you need to understand that if you go down that road, you are taking certain business risk on, and you need to operate that way. Certainly, you're going to have feature parity problems. One of your customers is going to call and say, hey, my buddy over at HHS is saying that they have this newfangled AI option that you just released. Why isn't it in my version? Oh, I'm sorry, sir, you're 2 versions behind. You have to update now. What's the cost of updating? Well, you're going to have to talk to your SI about that. We've seen this play before. It's not a bad play, You just have to go into this play with eyes open. And your customer needs to know that they are now inheriting the operational responsibility and the risk of managing that environment. So if they don't patch and they get hacked, that's on them. That's not Databricks' problem. That's your problem, sir. That conversation is different, right? So because customers now, many customers have also gotten used to the SaaS model of you provide me with an all-you-can-eat, turnkey, you manage the entire stack. They need to understand that this is not that. So like, it's a business model problem, or it's not a problem, it's a business model shift. And to your point, at Databricks, it sounds like, I mean, you guys were successfully able to scale to a point where now you can develop a plan to transition the customers into a true SaaS platform because you're ready to go there. That is something that's going to happen in your future. So as a company, you need to know that at some point 3 to 5 years from now, we have a major decision to make on, do we continue to support both models? Do we now move everybody to a different SaaS-based delivery model? Or if we continue to support both, here's the trade-offs we're going to make. So for example, when I was at Box, I was there 5 years, the intelligence community came to us. They offered us a significant amount of money. I would have been very, very happy if we'd closed that deal, to do exactly what you said. And actually, we talked to the board. We went all the way up and down to say, can we use your software but containerize it and put it in my container? But the ultimate decision the CEO was made that was, no, we're going to walk away from that very lucrative deal because it would have bifurcated the customer experience that the company didn't want to do. So it's a business decision that a company has to make. And sometimes it's in the favor of doing this way, and other times it's not. And so it's not an easy button to get around FedRAMP. I want to make that clear because you're inheriting certain trade-offs when you go down this way versus that way.
Yeah, I think those are key considerations, and you both kind of laid out, a double-edged sword where on one side you have to navigate multiple compliance frameworks of FedRAMP, FedRAMP Plus, SRG, intelligence community, right? But on the other side, you have to manage all the permutations of different hosting environments and certain, considerations for the agency, so on. So you really have to pick your poison on that front. So Brianna, I want to ask you, I know you're working with the marketplace team. What are your perspectives on how the marketplace can accelerate sales cycles and get consumption to federal buyers from a SaaS perspective?
Absolutely, Chris. So glad that you asked about that, because we really cannot divorce the issue of compliance and FedRAMP that we're talking about today from procurement and procurement friction. Because what we see more and more is this challenge that we can't shy away from, that industry partners are investing in achieving, FedRAMP authorization or other compliance requirements, but then where's their ROI? Where are their sales? And so what we have to do is recognize that we're asking industry to invest in meeting all of these compliance requirements that the government has set forth. And there has to be something at the end of that process for them. So that's where Marketplace comes in. AWS Marketplace offers a way to streamline procurement and make it more efficient while still maintaining the necessary guardrails, because of course there's always compliance issues with procurement as well. So let me give you a couple of examples about how we're doing that. First, I'll start with this notion of contract vehicles and KOs. So let's say you're an industry partner and you've gone through FedRAMP authorization, you're ready to sell. And you know that there's a customer out there wanting to buy your solution, because you wouldn't have invested in going through the FedRAMP authorization process if you didn't have some demand signals. So you've got that customer that wants to buy, and what's holding them up? What's stopping them from pressing the button? It's probably related to how they're going to get on contract with you. They're probably, I see people nodding in the audience. They're probably looking around saying, I need to find a KO. Where's there a contracting officer that can support me get on contract with this particular independent software vendor, this ISV? Well, there's clearly a shortage of KOs in the government right now. So they might also be wondering, how long is it going to take to establish this contract vehicle between the government and an ISV? I don't know how long it took for you. Maybe you said that you were lucky, so maybe it didn't take too long in your case, but I've heard stories of it taking 2+ years. 2 years just to establish a contract vehicle. And that process usually starts after you get the authorization that you needed. So where Marketplace comes in, how we work to streamline that procurement process and make it more efficient, is that we are giving government customers the capability to purchase third-party software, data, and services via the AWS Marketplace on existing cloud contract vehicles. That means that the government has a contract with AWS to buy cloud services. They're going to be then, through AWS Marketplace, one of our commercial services, buying your industry partners, software and services and data on that same cloud contract vehicle. That means that there's already a KO out there ready to support your government customer, your end user, because there's a KO assigned to their task order for their cloud contract vehicle already, and they can support their purchase of your SaaS solution as well. So that's one example where AWS Marketplace comes in. And Chris, if I may share one other example.
You forgot the clearances that you can also get through the IC Marketplace, which were incredibly valuable to particularly startup companies that have difficulty getting their own facility clearance.
Thanks, Howard. I appreciate you throwing that plug in there for us.
Well, it was incredibly beneficial for us.
I'm so glad that it was. And for federal civilian customers as well, you know, AWS Marketplace offers a lot of services and solutions and features that can help federal civilian customers to procure third-party software data and services through the marketplace. And one example of those features is something that we have called Vendor Insights. Vendor Insights, I like to think of it as the end-all, be-all for eliminating buyer's remorse. So Vendor Insights gives you as a buyer insight into what you're actually buying so that there are no surprises down the road. And it's a way that we're able to compile information from thousands of software vendors that are part of our AWS Marketplace and get them answers to the exact types of questions that the government is going to be asking. This is including and in addition to the types of questions that have to be answered for FedRAMP authorization. And this is a way that the government can have a streamlined and consolidated list of those questions and answers via the AWS Marketplace so that you don't have 20 different people in the same government agency, not to mention across 20 different government agencies, asking one partner the exact same question 200 times. And so that the government is able to see the answers to those questions and get access to those products more quickly, more efficiently. And so that industry partners are able to also expedite their delivery because they've consolidated their responses in one spot. And so that's one feature that we have with AWS Marketplace. My favorite piece about Vendor Insights is that once you do subscribe to a product via AWS Marketplace, you get automatic email notifications telling you if any of the vendors' responses to those questions that you reviewed previously have changed. That way you're aware of continual updates and you're able to meet your compliance requirements on a continual basis.
Yeah, we all love vendor questionnaires, so that sounds like a great resource to streamline that process and minimize the total weight, both for the agency as well as the vendor. And something you all have touched on to some extent already is like, DoD SRG, FedRAMP, intelligence community. So I'm curious from your experience and perspective, what are some false assumptions or unanticipated challenges that vendors, don't take into account before jumping into all these different markets and they have their own, kind of compliance considerations? And feel free, we'll start with you, Howard.
I mean, I think I articulated a lot of the problems at the start. There's just so many combinations and permutations. I'm going to answer your question a little bit differently. I think that the government has missed the opportunity here. Like everybody wants highly secure data and applications. And the fact that the government, not even expecting to do this, has created so many different standards that you actually end up getting less security. And what I would really advocate for the government to do is to pick one standard, maybe it's impact level 4 or impact level 5, and get everybody to adopt to it. That way, SaaS solution providers need to comply with one standard that secures everything. You might still have the problem of having to deliver it on the commercial cloud, on the gov cloud, and on the classified cloud. And you might still have the problem of having to deliver it on AWS, Azure, and GCP and others, but at least you're not dealing with several different compliance patterns. So that's my hope and that's my advocacy. I always thought when I retired, I would go back and become a lobbyist, and that would be my only issue. Let's get one standard for security. Nobody, the idea that the DoD's data is more critical than CMS's data or the IRS's data is absurd. Like, we can't risk any of that data. It's all got to be secure at the highest level. And so that's my
Yeah, I
response.
will make a little plug in the Office of National Cyber Director. They're not here, but they did put an RFI out, for regulatory harmonization. So maybe there's some hope there. We'll see what happens. But over to you, Don.
All right. Top 2 false assumptions that I see over and over again from our industry partners. Number 1 touches on Howard's point, and that is reciprocity. They assume that if they've gotten an approval or an authorization at one level or at one agency, it's going to work everywhere else. And that could be related to FedRAMP. It could be related to, IL 5 or 6, but it also could be related to other compliance issues that we haven't touched on yet, like foreign ownership, control, and influence. Just because I have an FCL with DoD means I'm good to go to sell at, an intelligence community agency. Sorry, not so much. They don't have reciprocity with each other. Okay. False assumption number 2 is I need to have FedRAMP or, one of these other compliance requirements that we talked about just to get my foot in the door and sell to the public sector or to the federal government. You don't. There are government customers out there that are using, like Chris mentioned, the commercial cloud that don't necessarily need FedRAMP High. So that means that you can already start selling to federal government customers without having FedRAMP authorization, FOCI approvals or an FCL, so on and so forth. There are opportunities to sell direct to the federal government without necessarily having all of these high bars for compliance regulations right away.
I wish I had given her answer.
How about you, Sonny? How about some unanticipated
I totally agree with everything Howard and it's been said before. I would like add, so first of all, cannot agree more on the harmonization problem, right? It started out for whatever reason, it started out and then it's just, metastasized over time. There was some work done along the way, like the SRG level 2 became harmonized to FedRAMP moderate, but that doesn't even make sense because level 2 only covers public information. Moderate should be more than public information, should have been for whatever, but nobody can tell the DoD what to do. I certainly can't. The problem is theoretically there is one standard. NIST defines that standard. It's the 800 series standard under NIST Special Pub 800, right? So one could argue that that is the one USG standard. Why does DoD needs its own? I don't know, but it's obviously a different environment, different domain. So yes, can we get to harmonization? Absolutely, hallelujah. Whatever we need to do to get there, 100% true. But then now we have California doing its own standard, state RAM being a thing. Texas wants data in Texas. Are you going to go tell Texas to stop messing around and just use FedRAMP? Probably not. So there is a natural kind of delineation between authorities and how they relate to how we trust the data that we have, our data, to be very right. So, binding corporate rules in Europe, very different from FedRAMP. I was part of the team that helped the government of Japan start their FedRAMP program called ISMAP. They married it over very aligned to FedRAMP, but of course they're going to want the core of jurisprudence and their residency be in Japan, not America. So there's going to be differences when you look at a global scale. The ideal case scenario for me is, can we get alignment on the line item level? So even if the entire baseline doesn't marry one to the other, but can we align to say encryption is encryption is encryption, TLS is TLS is TLS, and we just copy and paste across standards. And so my delta and your delta become the 20% problem rather than 100% problem. That to me is the way to go. Now, the second thing I will say is one common misconception that people need to know, which is surprising to me, but it's also understandable why it's a misconception, is the difference between a FedRAMP PATO and an agency ATO. They're not the same thing. Just because you have FedRAMP doesn't mean that an agency doesn't need to do additional due diligence before they put production data in your environment. And that makes sense. If you think about it in very simple terms, FedRAMP is all the common controls, but then there's agency implementation level controls that are going to be different agency to agency. You use Okta and you use Active Directory, you have to document those two things differently. They're not the same. And so that's implementation level control. You aggregate your logs in one product and you aggregate your logs in a different product. There's differences in your implementation and your implementation. So the idea is, though, that the agency ATO should only be the 15%, not the 100%. Now, unfortunately, not all agencies play nice, right? And they make it a 100% problem over and over again. That's not by design. That's something we should fight back on. So the idea is that 85% are common, 15% are unique to implementation, should only be worrying about 15% on a case-by-case basis. The one thing I like to say is that everybody likes to hit on FedRAMP. FedRAMP is an awful, terrible, no good, very bad program until you consider what the alternative is. And the alternative is to do this fucking thing over and over again for every agency you implement. It's better than that. Now, can we improve it? Can we invest in it? Can we streamline it with automation and so forth? Absolutely. And the trust problem is still a little problematic. I know too many people who've been, for good reasons, too many CISOs, who have never graduated past that, but my server doesn't sit under my desk, so how do I trust this? And so this reciprocity thing intellectually makes sense to a lot of people, but when it comes to the actual trust, we don't trust the PTO. They don't know what the hell they're doing. We're going to do our own thing. We got to get past that because we're all on a common baseline, or theoretically we are. Well, we're not all on the common baseline. We should be, but many of us are in a common baseline. I mean, think of the NIST standard. And we shouldn't be having to reprove over and over and over again how you meet the same standard that you just proved 15 other people before you.
Yeah, I think you all raise a great point in the sense that there needs to be regulatory harmonization. Maybe it won't be one standard to rule them all, but we have to rein it in and actually slow that sprawl because it's only getting worse as more regulatory and legal and litigation and so on continues to sprawl. And also, it's the point that it's impeding the agency's access to innovative technologies because of these duplicative, disparate processes that need to be reconciled.
Yeah, I mean, I looked recently, there are something like 20,000 SaaS applications in the marketplace worldwide, and 300 are FedRAMP, 15 are IL5, and the DoD can only put through 2 applications a year. So there's this intense need for, the government to modernize, yet the tooling to do that modernization just isn't approved. And we're in a no-win situation. And so the biggest losers here, in fact, are government and industry. Nobody wins in this situation.
And the American people.
That's right.
So, and not only that, but one quick comment, I think what happens here is like, just because it's not approved, and obviously it's a bottleneck, we know that it's still being used, but it's just not governed. So that's a problem as well that needs to be addressed. So Sunny, I wanted to ask you, we've had some great perspective from Howard about people who have taken a self-hosted approach and scaled and then went to FedRAMP. But I know you had some success stories about firms increasing growth and leveraging their FedRAMP authorization to drive revenue. So can you touch on that piece?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a pretty big cliff that you have to get over, right? It takes time and money and effort, and just because whether or not you decide as a company to invest in FedRAMP has no bearing on whether you're going to be successful in the marketplace. That's just a ticket to the ball. Doesn't mean that you know how to dance, right? So you may be in a competitive marketplace. Your prices may be too high compared to you may realize that you get into the marketplace and you're priced out, or the marketplace is shrinking, or the TAM is not large enough. You have to do that research at a time. Is this even a worthwhile marketplace to be in? If you build a left-handed widget that only 5 people in the federal government need, and you went through 2 years of FedRAMP approval and only 5 people who bought your product, it was not a big enough TAM, I'm sorry, that's on you. You need to kind of understand the market before you start investing in it. And now, having said that, there's the interesting thing about FedRAMP is, so when I used to both be on the JAB and then when I was outside the JAB and advising companies and helping Japan, for example, like as they were thinking about it, what was interesting to me is that all the industries that are adjacent to the government that don't have a cloud security standard, and frankly, that's every industry. Like if you look at financial services industry as writ large does not have a cloud security standard. They don't. Healthcare, HIPAA is not a cloud security standard. Hospitality, manufacturing, aerospace. None of these companies, now some of these downstream with 800-171 are requiring some discipline and some harmony and DFAR, et cetera. But generally speaking, if you're a bank, you care about data security too. You want to make sure your shit is patched. You want to make sure encryption is good. But there's no standard for you to point to and say, this company is doing the right thing and that one isn't. So we used to get calls all the time from international companies, from the government of Canada, from Goldman Sachs, from you name it, saying, hey, tell me more about this FedRAMP thing, because I've got a bunch of cloud companies that I want to use, and I don't know which one is good. And so how do I know one of them is encrypting things and which one isn't? Because not all cloud companies, of the 20,000, about 10,000 are owned by foreign nationals who are trying to grab our data. So how do you know which one is good and bad? So FedRAMP, while it's focused on U.S. federal government alone, but you start seeing acceleration in states, in cities, and localities, but then very quickly in other adjacent industries. So to me, the biggest story, so when I was at Box, I was there 5 years. We got our FedRAMP and we went from 0 to 100 million ARR just in public sector. But the company went from about 170 million ARR to $1 billion ARR, right? And the biggest acceleration was in regulated industries after we got FedRAMP. Banking and financial services, life sciences, healthcare, right? Because it was a badge of, okay, you guys are, whatever you're doing, we don't understand this stuff, but like you're secure because the government uses you, so now we can look at you. So it's just became an automatic accelerator. So my sellers who were selling to healthcare companies would start with, we're FedRAMP compliant, and then it would be like, well, it doesn't really matter until it does. So I remember selling to the government of Canada, and they're like, how do we know you're secure? And we said, we're FedRAMP compliant. It has nothing to do with Canada. And they're like, oh, okay, you're fine. You're probably fine. Actually, we weren't, because Canada requires data to be in Canada, and Canada requires data in transit to stay through Canada, which is a weird thing, because you can't touch this part of Canada to that part of Canada unless you go through the US. Anyway, but the point is that it becomes a blue ribbon conversation. And so companies who are investing in it understand that you will have acceleration outside of just the federal market. It's just a matter of monetizing it in the right way.
Yeah, I think Nix and I touched on this earlier with Insight Partners. He talked about how it's a signal to the broader regulated industries that you've done the due diligence, you've done the legwork to be used and trusted. The government's trusting you. And Howard looks like he has something to say.
Well, I was just going to say, nobody could argue with the ultimate success Amazon had after C2S. When the government announced that they were going to use C2S, I think that was a stamp of approval. And I know that served us well at Databricks as well.
Absolutely.
We got, the agency on board. We were never allowed to share that, but we had done enough work to secure the product for the agency. And as anybody inquired about the product, we had already buttoned up every single consideration or potential vulnerability because we had to do that for the government. So to Sunny's point, if you can satisfy the government, you're pretty much satisfying all of industry.
Yeah, so I want to ask you guys, we touched on this throughout the conversation a little bit, but what are some strategies you have seen be successful for firms who are looking to get in the federal market, but they know they need to clear hurdles like a sponsor, for example, or they don't understand FedRAMP and they don't know how to navigate the process, and they don't understand the requirements. What are some kind of parting recommendations before we open up to the audience here?
Yeah. Oh,
go ahead.
I can start with that one. So with AWS, we can definitely support ISVs in that journey. With AWS Marketplace, we can work with you on a go-to-market strategy together for the federal government, for the public sector. A few options are joining the Amazon Partner Network and listing in the AWS Marketplace. I see that these ISVs are at different stages of their journey with the public sector. So you might just be starting out trying to, market to the government or educate your public sector customers about your solution, or maybe you're seeking to get demos. Working with us and our teams to, get your foot in the door is definitely one path, one avenue. And then once you do have your foot in the door, once you've got that customer that says, I've seen the demo 100 times, I know I like it, I just don't know how to get it, that's when we have to work together on the marketplace front to support you in your procurement journey. And that's how we have to go in together to the government and help to educate them about what their options are for how they can procure your solution via the AWS Marketplace on their existing cloud contract. I know we're running out of time, so I could keep going on this topic. I'm super passionate about it, but I want to give Howard a chance before we go into the audience.
If you're SaaS and on-premise, sell on-premise to the federal government, it's a much lower bar. And if you're SaaS only, defer your federal government sales to establish yourself in other markets before you come into the federal government. Sonny?
I would say, first of all, if you're early stage, learn the baseline and make architecture decisions that will help you later on. That's going to significantly reduce the burden to go through that hurdle when you're ready. Secondly, understand that at any point, whether you sell to the government as a SaaS or non-SaaS, you have to still comply with 800-53. So don't be surprised that just because you have a software you can package up and send sell somebody in shrimp crab that you don't have any security or compliance responsibilities. You still do. It's just that balance is different. The government is taking on more of that responsibilities in that instance. But they will still come to you and ask you all the questions. You might as well start documenting that and having a point of view on that. Sooner or later, you're going to have to address FedRAMP. Sooner or later, if you're a 2024 company, you're not selling shit to run under desks. You're going to be some level of a cloud model at some point. And so you need to kind of, when you think about that, you need to also have a delta in your mind. So at any point, no matter where you are in the company's growth cycle, you need to understand what your delta is from your current architecture, infrastructure, and where the two needs to be to comply. Whether you choose to invest in it or not, you need to understand what that delta is. Use partners. Build your product on AWS, because that gives you so much acceleration in achieving that, because you don't have to worry about 2/3 of the stack all of a sudden. You only have to worry about your application controls. And last thing I'll say is start marketing early. Don't wait to start marketing your product into the market until you've achieved FedRAMP. In my experience, you should start about 18 months ahead of achieving FedRAMP. Start putting dollars into marketing. Get in front of customers, start sponsoring events, meeting people, showing demos, get some energy going. Because ultimately, if you achieve FedRAMP and nobody cares on the other side, then it's going to be another year to year and a half for you to start accelerating growth and marketing, so that by the time your sale happens, you got it FedRAMP, you spent all this time, effort, and money, and now you're waiting another 2 years before you get your first sale. So get it ready so that the customer is knocking on your door asking you, when is your FedRAMP going to be complete? Because I'm ready to write a check. That's where you want to be.
Yeah, great recommendations all around. And I apologize, we don't have time to take questions from the audience, so be sure to catch these folks in the hallway. But I also want to give a reminder, ask the experts with AWS and Aquia right across the hall if you have any technical or compliance questions, room 106. And that'll take us to our next session. So thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Ty.
Thank you, guys.